The Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 8. Close Work. Ghek, in his happier days, third foreman of the fields of Lud, sat nursing his anger and his humiliation. Recently, something had awakened within him the existence of which he had never before even dreamed. Had the influence of the strange captive woman aught to do with this unrest and dissatisfaction? He did not know. He missed the soothing influence of the noise she called singing. Could it be that there were other things more desirable than cold logic and undefiled brain power? Was well-balanced imperfection more to be sought after, then, than the high development of a single characteristic? He thought of the great ultimate brain toward which all kaldanes were striving. It would be deaf and dumb and blind. 1,000 beautiful strangers might sing and dance about it, but it could derive no pleasure from the singing or the dancing, since it would possess no perceptive faculties. Already had the kaldanes shut themselves off from most of the gratifications of the senses. Ghek wondered if much was to be gained by denying themselves still further, and with the thought came a question as to the whole fabric of their theory. After all, perhaps the girl was right. What purpose could a great brain serve sealed in the bowels of the earth? And he, Ghek, was to die for this theory. Lud had decreed it. The injustice of it overwhelmed him with rage, but he was helpless. There was no escape. Beyond the enclosure, the banths awaited him. Within, his own kind, equally as merciless and ferocious. Among them, there was no such thing as love, or loyalty, or friendship. They were just brains. He might kill Lud, but what would that profit him? Another king would be loosed from his sealed chamber, and Ghek would be killed. He did not know it, but he would not even have the poor satisfaction of satisfied revenge, since he was not capable of feeling so abstruse a sentiment. Ghek, mounted upon his rykor, paced the floor of the tower chamber in which he had been ordered to remain. Ordinarily, he would have accepted the sentence of Lud with perfect equanimity, but since it was but the logical result of reason. But now it seemed different. The stranger woman had bewitched him. Life appeared a pleasant thing. There were great possibilities in it. The dream of the ultimate brain had receded into a tenuous haze far in the background of his thoughts. At that moment there appeared in the doorway of the chamber a red warrior with naked sword. He was a male counterpart of the prisoner whose sweet voice had undermined the cold, calculating reason of the kaldane. "Silence!" admonished the newcomer, his straight brows gathered in an ominous frown, and the point of his longsword playing menacingly before the eyes of the kaldane. "I seek the woman Tara of Helium. Where is she? If you value your life, speak quickly and speak the truth." If he valued his life? It was a truth that Ghek had but just learned. He thought quickly. After all, a great brain is not without its uses. Perhaps here lay escape from the sentence of Lud. "You are of her kind?" he asked. "You come to rescue her?" "Yes." "Listen, then. I have befriended her, and because of this I am to die. If I help you to liberate her, will you take me with you?" Gahan of Gathol eyed the weird creature from crown to foot, the perfect body, the grotesque head, the expressionless face. Among such as these had the beautiful daughter of Helium been held captive for days and weeks. "If she lives and is unharmed," he said, "I will take you with us." "When they took her from me she was alive and unharmed," replied Ghek. I cannot say what has befallen her since Luud sent for her." "Who is Luud? Where is he? Lead me to him." Gahan spoke quickly in tones vibrant with authority. "Come then," said Ghek, leading the way from the apartment and down a stairway toward the underground burrows of the kaldanes. "Luud is my king. I will take you to his chambers." "Hasten!" urged Gahan. "Sheath your sword," warned Ghek, "so that should we pass others of my kind I may say to them that you are a new prisoner with some likelihood of winning their belief." Gahan did as he was bid, but warning the kaldane that his hand was ever ready at his dagger's hilt. "You need have no fear of treachery," said Ghek. "My only hope of life lies in you." "And if you fail me," Gahan admonished him, "I can promise you as sure a death as even your king might guarantee you." Ghek made no reply, but moved rapidly through the winding subterranean corridors until Gahan began to realize how truly was he in the hands of this strange monster. If the fellow should prove false it would profit Gahan nothing to slay him, since without his guidance the red man might never hope to retrace his way to the tower in freedom. Twice they met and were accosted by other kaldanes, but in both instances Ghek's simple statement that he was taking a new prisoner to Luud appeared to allay all suspicion, and then at last they came to the antechamber of the king. "Here, now, red man, thou must fight if ever," whispered Ghek. "Enter there," and he pointed to a doorway before them. "And you?" asked Gahan, still fearful of treachery. "My rykor is powerful," replied the kaldane. "I shall accompany you and fight at your side. As well die thus as in torture later at the will of Luud. Come." But Gahan had already crossed the room and entered the chamber beyond. Upon the opposite side of the room was a circular opening guarded by two warriors. Beyond this opening he could see two figures struggling upon the floor, and the fleeting glimpse he had of one of the faces suddenly endowed him with the strength of 10 warriors and the ferocity of a wounded banth. It was Tara of Helium, fighting for her honor or her life. The warriors, startled by the unexpected appearance of a red man, stood for a moment in dumb amazement, and in that moment Jed of Gathol was upon them, and one was down, a sword thrust through its heart. "Strike at the heads," whispered the voice of Ghek in Gahan's ear. The latter saw the head of the fallen warrior crawl quickly within the aperture leading to the chamber where he had seen Tara of Helium in the clutches of a headless body. Then the sword of Ghek struck the kaldane of the remaining warrior from its rykor, and Gahan ran his sword through the repulsive head. Instantly the red warrior leaped for the aperture, while close behind came Ghek. "Look not upon the eyes of Luud," warned the kaldane, "or you are lost." Within the chamber Gahan saw Tara of Helium in the clutches of a mighty body, while close to the wall upon the opposite side of the apartment crouched the hideous, spider-like Luud. Instantly the king realized the menace to himself and sought to fasten his eyes upon the eyes of Gahan, and in doing so he was forced to relax his concentration upon the rykor in whose embraces Tara struggled, so that almost immediately the girl found herself able to tear away from the awful, headless thing. As she rose quickly to her feet she saw for the first time the cause of the interruption of Luud's plans. A red warrior! Her heart leaped in rejoicing and thanksgiving. What miracle of fate had sent him to her? She did not recognize him, though, this travel-worn warrior in the plain harness which showed no single jewel. How could she have guessed him the same as the scintillant creature of platinum and diamonds that she had seen for a brief hour under such different circumstances at the court of her august sire? Luud saw Ghek following the strange warrior into the chamber. "Strike him down, Ghek," commanded the king. "Strike down the stranger, and your life shall be yours." Gahan glanced at the hideous face of the king. "Seek not his eyes!" screamed Tara in warning, but it was too late. Already the horrid, hypnotic glance of the king kaldane had seized upon the eyes of Gahan. The red warrior hesitated in his stride. His sword point drooped slowly toward the floor. Tara glanced toward Ghek. She saw the creature glaring with his expressionless eyes upon the broad back of the stranger. She saw the hand of the creature's rykor creeping stealthily toward the hilt of its dagger. And then Tara of Helium raised her eyes aloft and poured forth the notes of Mars' most beautiful melody, the song of love. Ghek drew his dagger from its sword. His eyes turned toward the singing girl. Luud's glance wavered from the eyes of the man to the face of Tara, and the instant that the latter's song distracted his attention from his victim, Gahan of Gathol shook himself, and as with a supreme effort of will forced his eyes to the wall above Luud's hideous head. Ghek raised his dagger above his right shoulder, took a single quick step forward, and struck. The girl's song ended in a stifled scream as she leaped forward with the evident intention of frustrating the kaldane's purpose. But she was too late, and well it was, for an instant later she realized the purpose of Ghek's act as she saw the dagger fly from his hand, pass Gahan's shoulder, and sink full to the guard in the soft face of Luud. "Come!" cried the assassin. "We have no time to lose," and started for the aperture through which they had entered the chamber. But in his stride he paused as his glance was arrested by the form of the mighty rykor lying prone upon the floor. A king's rykor, the most beautiful, the most powerful, that the breeders of Bantoom could produce. Ghek realized that in his escape he could take with him but a single rykor, and there was none in Bantoom that could give him better service than this giant lying here. Quickly he transferred himself to the shoulders of the great inert hulk. Instantly the latter was transformed to a sentient creature filled with pulsing life and alert energy. "Now," said the kaldane, "we are ready. Let whoso would revert to nothingness impede me." Even as he spoke he stooped and crawled into the chamber beyond, while Gahan, taking Tara by the arm, motioned her to follow. The girl looked him full in the eyes for the first time. "The gods of my people have been kind," she said. "You came just in time. To the thanks of Tara of Helium shall be added those of the warlord of Barsoom and his people. Thy reward shall surpass thy greatest desires." Gahan of Gathol saw that she did not recognize him, and quickly he checked the warm greeting that had been upon his lips. "Be thou Tara of Helium or another," he replied, "is immaterial. To serve thus a red woman of Barsoom is in itself sufficient reward." As they spoke, the girl was making her way through the aperture after Ghek, and presently all three had quitted the apartments of Luud and were moving rapidly along the winding corridors toward the tower. Ghek repeatedly urged them to greater speed, but the red men of Barsoom were never keen for retreat, and so the two that followed him moved all too slowly for the kaldane. "There are none to impede our progress," urged Gahan, "so why tax the strength of the princess by needless haste? I fear not so much opposition ahead, for there are none there who know the thing that has been done in Luud's chambers this night, but the kaldane of one of the warriors who stood guard before Luud's apartment escaped, and you may count it a truth that he lost no time in seeking aid. That it did not come before we left is due solely to the rapidity with which events transpired in the king's room. Long before we reach the tower they will be upon us from behind, and that they will come in numbers far superior to ours and with great and powerful rykors I well know." Nor was Ghek's prophecy long in fulfillment. Presently the sounds of pursuit became audible in the distant clanking of accoutrements and the whistling call to arms of the kaldanes. "The tower is but a short distance now," cried Ghek. "Make haste while yet you may, and if we can barricade it until the sun rises we may yet escape." "We shall need no barricades, for we shall not linger in the tower," replied Gahan, moving more rapidly as he realized from the volume of sound behind them the great number of their pursuers. "But we may not go further than the tower tonight," insisted Ghek. "Beyond the tower await the Banths and certain death." Gahan smiled. "Fear not the Banths," he assured them. "Can we but reach the enclosure a little ahead of our pursuers we have naught to fear from any evil power within this accursed valley." Ghek made no reply, nor did his expressionless face denote either belief or skepticism. The girl looked into the face of the man questioningly. She did not understand. "Your flier," he said. "It is moored before the tower." Her face lighted with pleasure and relief. "You found it!" she exclaimed. "What fortune!" "It was fortune indeed," he replied, "since it not only told that you were a prisoner here, but it saved me from the banths as I was crossing the valley from the hills to this tower into which I saw them take you this afternoon, after your brave attempt at escape." "How did you know it was I?" she asked, her puzzled brows scanning his face as though she sought to recall from past memories some scene in which he figured. "Who is there but knows of the loss of the Princess of Tara of Helium?" he replied, "and when I saw the device upon your flier I knew at once, though I had not known when I saw you among them in the fields a short time earlier. Too great was the distance for me to make certain whether the captive was man or woman. Had chance not divulged the hiding place of your flier I had gone my way, Tara of Helium. I shudder to think how close was the chance at that. But for the momentary shining of the sun upon the emblazoned device on the prow of your craft I had passed on unknowing." The girl shuddered. "The gods sent you," she whispered, reverently. "The gods sent me, Tara of Helium," he replied. "But I do not recognize you," she said. "I have tried to recall you, but I have failed. Your name, what may it be?" "It is not strange that so great a princess should not recall the face of every roving panthan of Barsoom," he replied with a smile. "But your name?" insisted the girl. "Call me Turan," replied the man, for it had come to him that if Tara of Helium recognized him as the man whose impetuous avowal of love had angered her that day in the gardens of the Warlord, her situation might be rendered infinitely less bearable than were she to believe him a total stranger. Then, too, as a simple panthan he might win a greater degree of her confidence by his loyalty and faithfulness and a place in her esteem that seemed to have been closed to the resplendent Jed of Gathol. They had reached the tower now, and as they entered it from the subterranean corridor a backward glance revealed the van of their pursuers, hideous kaldanes mounted upon swift and powerful rykors. As rapidly as might be the three ascended the stairways leading to the ground level, but after them, even more rapidly, came the minions of Luud. Ghek led the way, grasping one of Tara's hands the more easily to guide and assist her, while Gahan of Gathol followed a few paces in their rear, his bared sword ready for the assault that all realized must come upon them now before ever they reached the enclosure and the flier. "Let Ghek drop behind to your side," said Tara, "and fight with you." "There is but room for a single blade in these narrow corridors," replied the Gatholian. "Hasten on with Ghek and win to the deck of the flier. Have your hand upon the control, and if I come far enough ahead of these to reach the dangling cable you can rise at my word and I can clamber to the deck at my leisure. But if one of them emerges first into the enclosure you will know that I shall never come, and you will rise quickly and trust to the gods of our ancestors to give you a fair breeze in the direction of a more hospitable people." Tara of Helium shook her head. "We will not desert you, Panthan," she said. Gahan, ignoring her reply, spoke above her head to Ghek. "Take her to the craft moored within the enclosure," he commanded. "It is our only hope. Alone I must win to its deck, but have I to wait upon you two at the last moment the chances are that none of us will escape. Do as I bid." His tone was haughty and arrogant, the tone of a man who has commanded other men from birth and whose will has been law. Tara of Helium was both angered and vexed. She was not accustomed to being either commanded or ignored, but with all her royal pride she was no fool, and she knew the man was right, that he was risking his life to save hers. So she hastened on with Ghek as she was bid, and after the first flush of anger she smiled, for the realization came to her that this fellow was but a rough, untutored warrior, skilled not in the finer usages of cultured courts. His heart was right, though, a brave and loyal heart, and gladly she forgave him the offense of his tone and manner. But what a tone! Recollection of it gave her sudden pause. Panthans were rough and ready men. Often they rose to positions of high command, so it was not the note of authority in the fellow's voice that seemed remarkable, but something else, a quality that was indefinable, yet as distinct as it was familiar. She had heard before when the voice of her great-grandsire, Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium, had risen in command, and in the voice of her grandfather, Mors Kajak, the Jed, and in the ringing tones of her illustrious sire, John Carter, warlord of Barsoom, when he addressed his warriors. But now she had no time to speculate upon so trivial a thing, for behind her came the sudden clash of arms, and she knew that Turan the Panthan had crossed swords with the first of their pursuers. As she glanced back, he was still visible beyond a turn in the stairway, so that she could see the quick sword play that ensued. Daughter of a world's greatest swordsman, she knew well the finest points of the art. She saw the clumsy attack of the kaldane and the quick, sure return of the Panthan. As she looked down from above upon his almost naked body, trapped only in the simplest of unadorned harness, and saw the play of the lithe muscles beneath the red bronze skin, and witnessed the quick and delicate play of his sword point, to her sense of obligation was added a spontaneous admission of admiration that was but the natural tribute of a woman to skill and bravery, and perchance some trifle to manly symmetry and strength. 3 times the Panthan's blade changed its position, once to fend a savage cut, once to feint, and once to thrust. And as he withdrew it from the last position, the kaldane rolled lifeless from its stumbling rykor, and Turan sprang quickly down the steps to engage the next behind. And then Ghek had drawn Tara upward, and a turn in the stairway shut the battling Panthan from her view. But still she heard the ring of steel on steel, the clank of accoutrements, and the shrill whistling of the kaldanes. Her heart moved her to turn back to the side of her brave defender, but her judgment told her that she could serve him best by being ready at the control of the flier at the moment he reached the enclosure. This is the end of the Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 8. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 9. Adrift over strange regions. Presently, Ghek pushed aside a door that opened from the stairway, and before them Tara saw the moonlight flooding the walled court, where the headless rykors lay beside their feeding troughs. She saw the perfect bodies, muscled as the best of her father's fighting men, and the females, whose figures would have been the envy of many of Helium's most beautiful women. Ah, if she could but endow these with the power to act! Then indeed might the safety of the Panthan be assured. But they were only poor lumps of clay, nor had she the power to quicken them to life. Ever must they lie thus until dominated by the cold, heartless brain of the kaldane. The girl sighed in pity, even as she shuddered in disgust as she picked her way over and among the sprawled creatures toward the flier. Quickly, she and Ghek mounted to the deck after the latter had cast off the moorings. Tara tested the control, raising and lowering the ship a few feet within the walled space. It responded perfectly. Then she lowered it to the ground again and waited. From the open doorway came the sounds of conflict, now nearing them, now receding. The girl, having witnessed her champion's skill, had little fear of the outcome. Only a single antagonist could face him at a time upon the narrow stairway. He had the advantage of position and of the defensive, and he was a master of the sword, while they were clumsy bunglers by comparison. Their sole advantage was in their numbers, unless they might find a way to come upon him from behind. She paled at the thought. Could she have seen him she might have been further perturbed, for he took no advantage of many opportunities to win nearer the enclosure. He fought coolly, but with a savage persistence that bore little semblance to purely defensive action. Often he clambered over the body of a fallen foe to leap against the next behind, and once there lay 5 dead kaldanes behind him. So far had he pushed back his antagonists. These kaldanes that he fought, nor did the girl awaiting them upon the flier, but Gahan of Gathol was engaged in a more alluring sport than winning to freedom, for he was avenging the indignities that had been put upon the woman he loved. But presently he realized that he might be jeopardizing her safety uselessly, and so he struck down another before him and turning leaped quickly up the stairway, while the leading kaldanes slipped upon the brain-covered floor and stumbled in pursuit. Gahan reached the enclosure 20 paces ahead of them and raced toward the flier. "Rise!" he shouted to the girl. "I will ascend the cable." Slowly the small craft rose from the ground as Gahan leaped the inert bodies of the rykors lying in his path. The first of the pursuers sprang from the tower just as Gahan seized the trailing rope. "Faster!" he shouted to the girl above, "or they will drag us down." But the ship seemed scarcely to move, though in reality she was rising as rapidly as might have been expected of a one-man flier carrying a load of 3. Gahan swung free above the top of the wall, but the end of the rope still dragged the ground as the kaldanes reached it. They were pouring in a steady stream from the tower into the enclosure. The leader seized the rope. "Quick!" he cried. "Lay hold, and we will drag them down." It needed but the weight of a few to accomplish his design. The ship was stopped in its flight, and then, to the horror of the girl, she felt it being dragged steadily downward. Gahan, too, realized the danger and the necessity for instant action. Clinging to the rope with his left hand, he had wound a leg about it, leaving his right hand free for his long sword which he had not sheathed. A downward cut clove the soft head of a kaldane, and another severed the taut rope beneath the panthan's feet. The girl heard a sudden renewal of the shrill whistling of her foes, and at the same time she realized that the craft was rising again. Slowly it drifted upward, out of reach of the enemy, and a moment later she saw the figure of Turan clamber over the side. For the first time in many weeks her heart was filled with the joy of thanksgiving, but her first thought was of another. "You are not wounded?" she asked. "No, Tara of Helium," he replied. "They were scarce worth the effort of my blade, and never were they a menace to me because of their swords." "They should have slain you easily," said Ghek. "So great and highly developed is the power of reason among us that they should have known before you struck just where, logically, you must seek to strike, and so they should have been able to parry your every thrust and easily find an opening to your heart." "But they did not, Ghek," Gahan reminded him. "Their theory of development is wrong, for it does not tend toward a perfectly balanced whole. You have developed the brain and neglected the body, and you can never do with the hands of another what you can do with your own hands. Mine are trained to the sword. Every muscle responds instantly and accurately, and almost mechanically, to the need of the instant. I am scarcely objectively aware that I think when I fight, so quickly does my point take advantage of every opening, or spring to my defense if I am threatened, that it is almost as though the cold steel had eyes and brains. You, with your kaldane brain and your rykor body, never could hope to achieve, in the same degree of perfection, those things that I can achieve. Development of the brain should not be the sum total of human endeavor. The richest and happiest peoples will be those who attain closest to well-balanced perfection of both mind and body, and even these must always be short of perfection. In absolute and general perfection lies stifling monotony and death. Nature must have contrasts, she must have shadows as well as highlights, sorrow with happiness, both wrong and right, and sin as well as virtue." "Always have I been taught differently," replied Ghek. but since I have known this woman and you, of another race, I have come to believe that there may be other standards fully as high and desirable as those of the kaldanes. At least I have had a glimpse of the thing you call happiness, and I realize that it may be good even though I have no means of expressing it. I cannot laugh nor smile, and yet within me is a sense of contentment when this woman sings, a sense that seems to open before me wondrous vistas of beauty and unguessed pleasure that far transcend the cold joys of a perfectly functioning brain. I would that I had been born of thy race." Caught by a gentle current of air, the flier was drifting slowly toward the northeast, across the valley of Bantoom. Below them lay the cultivated fields, and one after another they passed over the strange towers of Moak and Nolak and the other kings of the swarms that inhabited this weird and terrible land. Within each enclosure surrounding the towers grovelled the rykors, repellent, headless things, beautiful yet hideous. "A lesson those," remarked Gahan, indicating the rykors in an enclosure above which they were drifting at the time, "to that fortunately small minority of our race which worships the flesh and makes a god of appetite. You know them, Tara of Helium. They can tell you exactly what they had at the midday meal 2 weeks ago, and how the loin of the thoat should be prepared, and what drink should be served with the rump of the zitidar." Tara of Helium laughed. "But not one of them could tell you the name of the man whose painting took the Jedak's award in the Temple of Beauty this year," she said. "Like the rykors, their development has not been balanced. Fortunate indeed are those in which there is combined a little good and a little bad, a little knowledge of many things outside their own callings, a capacity for love and a capacity for hate, for such as these can look with tolerance upon all, unbiased by the egotism of him whose head is so heavy on one side that all his brains run to that point." As Gahan ceased speaking, Ghek made a little noise in his throat as one does who would attract attention. "You speak as one who has thought much upon many subjects. Is it, then, possible that you of the red race have pleasure in thought? Do you know aught of the joys of introspection? Do reason and logic form any part of your lives?" "Most assuredly," replied Gahan, "but not to the extent of occupying all our time, at least not objectively. You, Ghek, are an example of the egotism of which I spoke. Because you and your kind devote your lives to the worship of mind, you believe that no other created beings think, and possibly we do not in the sense that you do, who think only of yourselves and your great brains. We think of many things that concern the welfare of a world. Had it not been for the red men of Barsoom, even the kaldanes had perished from the planet, for while you may live without air, the things upon which you depend for existence cannot. And there had been no air in sufficient quantities upon Barsoom these many ages, had not a red man planned and built the great atmosphere plant which gave new life to a dying world. What have all the brains of all the kaldanes that have ever lived done to compare with that single idea of a single red man?" Ghek was stumped. Being a kaldane, he knew that brains spelled the sum total of universal achievement, but it had never occurred to him that they should be put to use in practical and profitable ways. He turned away and looked down upon the valley of his ancestors, across which he was slowly drifting. Into what unknown world? He should be a veritable god among the underlings, he knew, but somehow a doubt assailed him. It was evident that these two from that other world were ready to question his preeminence. Even through his great egotism was filtering a suspicion that they patronized him, perhaps even pitied him. Then he began to wonder what was to become of him. No longer would he have many rykors to do his bidding, only this single one, and when it died there could not be another. When it tired, Ghek must lie almost helpless while it rested. He wished that he had never seen this red woman. She had brought him only discontent and dishonor and now exile. Presently Tara of Helium commenced to hum a tune, and Ghek, the kaldane, was content. Gently they drifted beneath the hurtling moons above the mad shadows of a Martian night. The roaring of the banths came in diminishing volume to their ears as their craft passed on beyond the boundaries of Bantoom, leaving behind the terrors of that unhappy land. But to what were they being borne? The girl looked at the man sitting cross-legged upon the deck of the tiny flier, gazing off into the night ahead, apparently absorbed in thought. "Where are we?" she asked. "Toward what are we drifting?" Turan shrugged his broad shoulders. "The stars tell me that we are drifting toward the northeast," he replied, "but where we are, or what lies in our path, I cannot even guess. A week since I could have sworn that I knew what lay behind each succeeding ridge that I approached, but now I admit in all humility that I have no conception of what lies a mile in any direction. Tara of Helium, I am lost, and that is all that I can tell you." He was smiling, and the girl smiled back at him. There was a slightly puzzled expression on her face. There was something tantalizingly familiar about that smile of his. She had met many a panthan. They came and went, following the fighting of a world, but she could not place this one. "From what country are you, Turan?" she asked suddenly. "Know you not, Tara of Helium," he countered, "that a panthan has no country? Today he fights beneath the banner of one master, tomorrow beneath that of another." "But you must owe allegiance to some country when you are not fighting," she insisted. "What banner, then, owns you now?" He rose and stood before her, then, bowing low, "And I am acceptable," he said. "I serve beneath the banner of the daughter of the Warlord, now and forever." She reached forth and touched his arm with a slim brown hand. "Your services are accepted," she said, "and if ever we reach Helium I promise that your reward shall be all that your heart could desire." "I shall serve faithfully, hoping for that reward," he said, but Tara of Helium did not guess what was in his mind, thinking rather that he was mercenary. For how could the proud daughter of the Warlord guess that a simple panthan aspired to her hand and heart? The dawn found them moving rapidly over an unfamiliar landscape. The wind had increased during the night and had borne them far from Bantoom. The country below them was rough and inhospitable. No water was visible, and the surface of the ground was cut by deep gorges, while nowhere was any but the most meager vegetation discernible. They saw no life of any nature, nor was there any indication that the country could support life. For 2 days they drifted over this horrid wasteland. They were without food or water and suffered accordingly. Ghek had temporarily abandoned his rykor after enlisting Turan's assistance in lashing it safely to the deck. The less he used it, the less would its vitality be spent. Already it was showing the effects of privation. Ghek crawled about the vessel like a great spider, over the side, down beneath the keel, and up over the opposite rail. He seemed equally at home one place as another. For his companions, however, the quarters were cramped, for the deck of a one-man flier is not intended for 3. Turan sought always for signs of water. Water they must have, or that water-giving plant which makes life possible upon many of the seemingly arid areas of Mars. But there was neither the one nor the other for these 2 days, and now the 3rd night was upon them. The girl did not complain, but Turan knew that she must be suffering, and his heart was heavy within him. Ghek suffered least of all, and he explained to them that his kind could exist for long periods without food or water. Turan almost cursed him as he saw the form of Tara of Helium slowly wasting away before his eyes, while the hideous kaldane seemed as full of vitality as ever. "There are circumstances," remarked Ghek, "under which a gross and material body is less desirable than a highly developed brain." Turan looked at him, but said nothing. Tara of Helium smiled faintly. "One cannot blame him," she said. "Were we not a bit boastful in the pride of our superiority? When our stomachs were filled," she added. "Perhaps there is something to be said for their system," Turan admitted. "If we could but lay aside our stomachs when they cried for food and water I have no doubt but that we should do so." "I should never miss mine now," assented Tara. "It is mighty poor company." A new day had dawned, revealing a less desolate country, and renewing again the hope that had been low within them. Suddenly Turan leaned forward, pointing ahead. "Look, Tara of Helium!" he cried. "A city! As I am Turan the panthan, a city!" Far in the distance the domes and walls and slender towers of a city shone in the rising sun. Quickly the man seized the control and the ship dropped rapidly behind a low range of intervening hills, for well Turan knew that they must not be seen until they could discover whether friend or foe inhabited the strange city. Chances were that they were far from the abode of friends, and so must the panthan move with the utmost caution; but there was a city, and where a city was water, even though it were a deserted city, and food if it were inhabited. To the red man food and water, even in the citadel of an enemy, meant food and drink for Tara of Helium. He would accept it from friends or he would take it from enemies. Just so long as it was there he would have it, and there was shown the egotism of a fighting man, though Turan did not see it, nor Tara who came from a long line of fighting men, but Ghek might have smiled had he known how. Turan permitted the flier to drift closer behind the screening hills, and then when he could advance no farther without fear of discovery he dropped the craft gently to the ground in a little ravine, and leaping over the side made her fast to a stout tree. For several moments they discussed their plans, whether it would be best to wait where they were until darkness hid their movements and then approach the city in search of food and water, or approach it now, taking advantage of what cover they could, until they could glean something of the nature of its inhabitants. It was Turan's plan which finally prevailed. They would approach as close as safety dictated, in the hope of finding water outside the city, food too perhaps. If they did not they could at least reconnoiter the ground by daylight, and then when night came Turan could quickly come close to the city and in comparative safety prosecute his search for food and drink. Following the ravine upward they finally topped the summit of the ridge, from which they had an excellent view of that part of the city which lay nearest them, though themselves hidden by the brush behind which they crouched. Ghek had resumed his rykor, which had suffered less than either Tara or Turan through their enforced fast. The first glance at the city, now much closer than when they had first discovered it, revealed the fact that it was inhabited. Banners and pennons broke from many a staff. People were moving about the gate before them. The high white walls were paced by sentinels at far intervals. Upon the roofs of higher buildings the women could be seen airing the sleeping silks and furs. Turan watched it all in silence for some time. "I do not know them," he said at last. "I cannot guess what city this may be, but it is an ancient city. Its people have no flyers and no firearms. It must be old indeed." "How do you know they have not these things?" asked the girl. "There are no landing stages upon the roofs, not one that can be seen from here. While we were looking similarly at Helium we would see hundreds, and they have no firearms because their defenses are all built to withstand the attack of spear and arrow. With spear and arrow, they are an ancient people." "If they are ancient perhaps they are friendly," suggested the girl. "Did we not learn as children in the history of our planet that it was once peopled by a friendly, peace-loving race?" "But I fear they are not as ancient as that," replied Turan, laughing. It has long been ages since the men of Barsoom loved peace." "My father loves peace," returned the girl. "And yet he is always at war," said the man. She laughed. "But he says he likes peace." "We all like peace," he rejoined. "Peace with honor, but our neighbors will not let us have it, and so we must fight." "And to fight well men must like to fight," she added. "And to like to fight they must know how to fight," he said, "for no man likes to do the thing that he does not know how to do well, or that some other man can do better than he." "And so always there will be wars and men will fight," he concluded, "for always the men with hot blood in their veins will practice the art of war." "We have settled a great question," said the girl, smiling, "but our stomachs are still empty." "Your panthan is neglecting his duty," replied Turan. "And how can he with the great reward always before his eyes?" She did not guess in what literal a sense he spoke. "I go forthwith," he continued, "to wrest food and drink from the ancients." "No," she cried, laying a hand upon his arm, "not yet. They would slay you or make you a prisoner. You are a brave panthan and a mighty one, but you cannot overcome a city single handed." She smiled up into his face and her hand still lay upon his arm. He felt the thrill of hot blood coursing through his veins. He could have seized her in his arms and crushed her to him. There was only Ghek the kaldane there, but there was something stronger within him that restrained his hand. Who may define it, that inherent chivalry that renders certain men the natural protectors of women? From their vantage point they saw a body of armed warriors ride forth from the gate, and winding along a well beaten road pass from sight about the foot of the hill from which they watched. The men were red, like themselves, and they rode the small saddled thoats of the red race. Their trappings were barbaric and magnificent, and in their headdress were many feathers, as had been the custom of the ancients. They were armed with swords and long spears, and they rode almost naked, their bodies being painted in ochre and blue and white. There were perhaps a score of them in the party, and as they galloped away on their tireless mounts they presented a picture at once savage and beautiful. "They have the appearance of splendid warriors," said Turan. "I have a great mind to walk boldly into their city and seek service." Tara shook her head. "Wait," she admonished. "What would I do without you, and if you were captured how could you collect your reward?" "I should escape," he said. "At any rate I shall try it," and he started to rise. "You shall not," said the girl, her tone all authority. The man looked at her quickly, questioningly. "You have entered my service," she said, a trifle haughtily. "You have entered my service for hire, and you shall do as I bid you." Turan sank down beside her again with a half smile upon his lips. "It is yours to command, Princess," he said. The day passed. Ghek, tiring of the sunlight, had deserted his rykor and crawled down a hole he had discovered close by. Tara and Turan reclined beneath the scant shade of a small tree. They watched the people coming and going through the gate. The party of horsemen did not return. A small herd of zitidars was driven into the city during the day, and once a caravan of broad-wheeled carts drawn by these huge animals wound out of the distant horizon and came down to the city. It, too, passed from their sight within the gateway. Then darkness came, and Tara of Helium bid her panthan search for food and drink, but she cautioned him against attempting to enter the city. Before he left her he bent and kissed her hand, as a warrior may kiss the hand of his queen. This is the end of the Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 9. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Chessmen of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 10. Entrapped. Turan the Panthan approached the strange city under cover of the darkness. He entertained little hope of finding either food or water outside the wall, but he would try, and then, if he failed, he would attempt to make his way into the city, for Tara of Helium must have sustenance and have it soon. He saw that the walls were poorly sentineled, but they were sufficiently high to render an attempt to scale them foredoomed to failure. Taking advantage of underbrush and trees, Turan managed to reach the base of the wall without detection. Silently he moved north past the gateway, which was closed by a massive gate which effectively barred even the slightest glimpse within the city beyond. It was Turan's hope to find upon the north side of the city, away from the hills, a level plain where grew the crops of the inhabitants, and here too water from their irrigating system. But though he traveled far along that seemingly interminable wall, he found no fields nor any water. He searched also for some means of ingress to the city, yet here too failure was his only reward. And now, as he went, keen eyes watched him from above, and a silent stalker kept pace with him for a time upon the summit of the wall. But presently the shadower descended to the pavement within, and hurrying swiftly raced ahead of the stranger without. He came presently to a small gate beside which was a low building, and before the doorway of the building a warrior standing guard. He spoke a few quick words to the warrior, and then entered the building only to return almost immediately to the street, followed by fully 40 warriors. Cautiously opening the gate, the fellow peered carefully along the wall upon the outside in the direction from which he had come. Evidently satisfied, he issued a few words of instructions to those behind him, whereupon half the warriors followed the man stealthily through the gateway, where they crouched low among the shrubbery in a half circle just north of the gateway, which they had left open. Here they waited in utter silence, nor had they long to wait before Turan the Panthan came cautiously along the base of the wall. To the very gate he came, and when he found it and that it was open, he paused for a moment, listening. Then he approached and looked within. Assured that there was none within sight to apprehend him, he stepped through the gateway into the city. He found himself in a narrow street that paralleled the wall. Upon the opposite side rose buildings of an architecture unknown to him, yet strangely beautiful. While the buildings were packed closely together, there seemed to be no two alike, and their fronts were all shapes and heights and of many hues. The skyline was broken by spire and dome and minaret and tall slender towers, while the walls supported many a balcony, and in the soft light of Cluros, the farther moon, now low in the west, he saw to his surprise and consternation the figures of people upon the balconies. Directly opposite him were 2 women and a man. They sat leaning upon the rail of the balcony, looking, apparently, directly at him, but if they saw him they gave no sign. Turan hesitated a moment in the face of almost certain discovery, and then, assured that they must take him for one of their own, he moved boldly into the avenue. Having no idea of the direction in which he might best hope to find what he sought, and not wishing to arouse suspicion by further hesitation, he turned to the left and stepped briskly along the pavement with the intention of placing himself as quickly as possible beyond the observation of those nocturnal watchers. He knew that the night must be far spent, and so he could not but wonder why people should sit upon their balconies when they should have been asleep among their silks and furs. At first he had thought them the late guests of some convivial host, but the windows behind them were shrouded in darkness, and utter quiet prevailed, quite upsetting such a theory. And as he proceeded he passed many another group sitting silently upon other balconies. They paid no attention to him, seeming not even to note his passing. Some leaned with a single elbow upon the rail, their chins resting in their palms. Others leaned upon both arms across the balcony, looking down into the street, while several that he saw held musical instruments in their hands, but their fingers moved not upon the strings. And then Turan came to a point where the avenue turned to the right, to skirt a building that jutted from the inside of the city wall, and as he rounded the corner he came full upon two warriors standing upon either side of the entrance to a building upon his right. It was impossible for them not to be aware of his presence, yet neither moved, nor gave other evidence that they had seen him. He stood there waiting, his hand upon the hilt of his longsword, but they neither challenged nor halted him. Could it be that these also thought him to be one of their own kind? Indeed, upon no other grounds could he explain their inaction. As Turan had passed through the gateway into the city and taken his unhindered way along the avenue, 20 warriors had entered the city and closed the gate behind them, and then one had taken to the wall and followed along its summit in the rear of Turan, and another had followed him along the avenue, while the third had crossed the street and entered one of the buildings upon the opposite side. The balance of them, with the exception of a single sentinel beside the gate, had re-entered the building from which they had been summoned. They were well built, strapping, painted fellows, their naked figures covered now by gorgeous robes against the chill of night. As they spoke of the stranger, they laughed at the ease with which they had tricked him, and were still laughing as they threw themselves upon their sleeping silks and furs to resume their broken slumber. It was evident that they constituted a guard detailed for the gate beside which they slept, and it was equally evident that the gates were guarded and the city watched much more carefully than Turan had believed. Chagrined indeed had been the Jed of Gathol had he dreamed that he was being so neatly tricked. As Turan proceeded along the avenue he passed other sentries beside other doors, but now he gave them small heed, since they neither challenged nor otherwise outwardly noted his passing. But while at nearly every turn of the erratic avenue he passed one or more of these silent sentinels, he could not guess that he had passed one of them many times, and that his every move was watched by silent, clever stalkers. Scarce had he passed a certain one of these rigid guardsmen before the fellow awoke to sudden life, bounded across the avenue, entered a narrow opening in the outer wall where he swiftly followed a corridor built within the wall itself until presently he emerged a little distance ahead of Turan, where he assumed the stiff and silent attitude of a soldier upon guard. Nor did Turan know that a second followed in the shadows of the buildings behind him, nor of the third, who hastened ahead of him upon some urgent mission. And so the panthan moved through the silent streets of the strange city in search of food and drink for the woman he loved. Men and women looked down upon him from shadowy balconies, but spoke not, and sentinels saw him pass and did not challenge. Presently, from along the avenue before him came the familiar sound of clanking accouterments, the herald of marching warriors, and almost simultaneously he saw upon his right an open doorway dimly lighted from within. It was the only available place where he might seek to hide from the approaching company, and while he had passed several sentries unquestioned, he could scarce hope to escape scrutiny and questioning from a patrol, as he naturally assumed this body of men to be. Inside the doorway he discovered a passage turning abruptly to the right and almost immediately thereafter to the left. There was none in sight within, and so he stepped cautiously around the second turn, the more effectually to be hidden from the street. Before him stretched a long corridor, dimly lighted like the entrance. Waiting there, he heard the party approach the building, he heard someone at the entrance to his hiding place, and then he heard the door past which he had come slam to. He laid his hand upon his sword, expecting momentarily to hear footsteps approaching along the corridor, but none came. He approached the turn and looked around it. The corridor was empty to the closed door. Whoever had closed it had remained upon the outside. Turan waited, listening. He heard no sound. Then he advanced to the door and placed an ear against it. All was silence in the street beyond. A sudden draft must have closed the door, or perhaps it was the duty of the patrol to see to such things. It was immaterial. They had evidently passed on, and now he would return to the street and continue upon his way. Somewhere there would be a public fountain where he could obtain water, and the chance of food lay in the strings of dried vegetables and meat which hung before the doorways of nearly every Barsoomian home of the poorer classes that he had ever seen. It was this district he was seeking, and it was for this reason his search had led him away from the main gate of the city, which he knew would not be located in a poor district. He attempted to open the door, only to find that it resisted his every effort. It was locked upon the outside. Here indeed was a sorry contretemps. Turan the panthan scratched his head. "Fortune frowns upon me," he murmured, but beyond the door, Fate, in the form of a painted warrior, stood smiling. Neatly had he tricked the unwary stranger. The lighted doorway, the marching patrol, these had been planned and timed to a nicety by the third warrior, who had sped ahead of Turan along another avenue, and the stranger had done precisely what the fellow had thought he would do. No wonder, then, that he smiled. This exit barred to him, Turan turned back into the corridor. He followed it cautiously and silently. Occasionally there was a door on one side or the other. These he tried, only to find each securely locked. The corridor wound more erratically the farther he advanced. A locked door barred his way at its end, but a door upon his right opened and he stepped into a dimly lighted chamber, about the walls of which were 3 other doors, each of which he tried in turn. 2 were locked. The other opened upon a runway leading downward. It was spiral, and he could see no further than the first turn. A door in the corridor he had quitted opened after he had passed, and the third warrior stepped out and followed after him. A faint smile still lingered upon the fellow's grim lips. Turan drew his short sword and cautiously descended. At the bottom was a short corridor with a closed door at the end. He approached the single heavy panel and listened. No sound came to him from beyond the mysterious portal. Gently he tried the door, which swung easily toward him at his touch. Before him was a low-ceiled chamber with a dirt floor. Set in its walls were several other doors, and all were closed. As Turan stepped cautiously within, the third warrior descended the spiral runway behind him. The panthan crossed the room quickly and tried a door. It was locked. He heard a muffled click behind him and turned about with ready sword. He was alone, but the door through which he had entered was closed. It was the click of its lock that he heard. With a bound he crossed the room and attempted to open it, but to no avail. No longer did he seek silence, for he knew now that the thing had gone beyond the sphere of chance. He threw his weight against the wooden panel, but the thick steel of which it was constructed would have withstood a battering ram. From beyond came a low laugh. Rapidly Turan examined each of the other doors. They were all locked. A glance about the chamber revealed a wooden table and a bench. Set in the walls were several heavy rings to which rusty chains were attached, all too significant of the purpose to which the room was dedicated. In the dirt floor near the wall were 2 or 3 holes resembling the mouths of burrows, doubtless the habitat of the giant Martian rat. He had observed this much when suddenly the dim light was extinguished, leaving him in darkness, utter and complete. Turan, groping about, sought the table and the bench. Placing the latter against the wall, he drew the table in front of him and sat down upon the bench, his long sword gripped in readiness before him. At least they should fight before they took him. For some time he sat there waiting for he knew not what. No sound penetrated to his subterranean dungeon. He slowly revolved in his mind the incidents of the one evening: the open, unguarded gate, the lighted doorway, the only one he had seen thus open and lighted along the avenue he had followed, the advance of the warriors at precisely the moment that he could find no other avenue of escape or concealment, the corridors and chambers that led past many locked doors to this underground prison, leaving no other path for him to pursue. Be my first ancestor, he swore, but it was simple, and I a simpleton. They tricked me neatly and have taken me without exposing themselves to a scratch. But for what purpose? He wished that he might answer that question, and then his thoughts turned to the girl waiting there on the hill beyond the city for him, and he would never come. He knew the ways of the more savage peoples of Barsoom. No, he would never come now. He had disobeyed her. He smiled at the sweet recollection of those words of command that had fallen from her dear lips. He had disobeyed her, and now he had lost the reward. But what of her? What now would be her fate, starving before a hostile city with only an inhuman kaldane for company? Another thought, a horrid thought, obtruded itself upon him. She had told him of the hideous sights she had witnessed in the burrows of kaldanes, and he knew that they ate human flesh. Ghek was starving. Should he eat his rykor he would be helpless, but there was sustenance there for them both, for the rykor and the kaldane. Turan cursed himself for a fool. Why had he left her? Far better to have remained and died with her, ready always to protect her, than to have left her at the mercy of the hideous Bantoomian. Now Turan detected a heavy odor in the air. It oppressed him with a feeling of drowsiness. He would have risen to fight off the creepy lethargy, but his legs seemed weak, so that he sank again to the bench. Presently his sword slipped from his fingers and he sprawled forward upon the table, his head resting upon his arms. Tara of Helium, as the night wore on and Turan did not return, became more and more uneasy, and when dawn broke with no sign of him, she guessed that he had failed. Something more than her own unhappy predicament brought a feeling of sorrow to her heart, of sorrow and loneliness. She realized now how she had come to depend upon this panthan, not only for protection, but for companionship as well. She missed him, and in missing him realized suddenly that he had meant more to her than a mere hired warrior. It was as though a friend had been taken from her, an old and valued friend. She rose from her place of concealment that she might have a better view of the city. Udor, dwar of the 8th Utan of Otar, Jeddak of Manator, rode back in the early dawn toward Manator from a brief excursion to a neighboring village. As he was rounding the hills south of the city, his keen eyes were attracted by a slight movement among the shrubbery close to the summit of the nearest hill. He halted his vicious mount and watched more closely. He saw a figure rise, facing away from him, and peer down toward Manator beyond the hill. "Come," he signaled to his followers, and with a word to his thoat turned the beast at a rapid gallop up the hillside. In his wake swept 20 savage warriors, the padded feet of their mounts soundless upon the soft turf. It was the rattle of sidearms and harness that brought Tara of Helium suddenly about, facing them. She saw a score of warriors, with couched lances bearing down upon her. She glanced at Ghek. What would the Spider-Man do in this emergency? She saw him crawl to his rykor and attach himself. Then he arose, the beautiful body once again animated and alert. She thought that the creature was preparing for flight. Well, it made little difference to her. Against such as were streaming up the hill toward them, a single mediocre swordsman such as Ghek was worse than no defense at all. "Hurry, Ghek," she admonished him. "Back into the hills. You may find there a hiding place." But the creature only stepped between her and the oncoming riders, drawing his long sword. "It is useless, Ghek," she said, when she saw that he intended to defend her. "What can a single sword accomplish against such odds?" "I can die but once," replied the kaldane. "You and your panthan saved me from Luud, and I but do what your panthan would do were he here to protect you." "It is brave, but it is useless," she replied. "Sheath your sword. They may not intend us harm." Ghek let the point of his weapon drop to the ground, but he did not sheath it, and thus the two stood waiting as U Dor the dwar stopped his thoat before them while his 20 warriors formed a rough circle about. For a long minute U Dor sat his mount in silence, looking searchingly first at Tara of Helium and then at her hideous companion. "What manner of creature are you?" he asked presently, "and what do you before the gates of Manator?" "We are from far countries," replied the girl, "and we are lost and starving. We ask only food and rest and the privilege to go our way, seeking our own homes." U Dor smiled a grim smile. "Manator and the hills which guard it alone know the age of Manator," he said. "Yet in all the ages that have rolled by since Manator first was, there be no record in the annals of Manator of a stranger departing from Manator." "But I am a princess," cried the girl haughtily, "and my country is not at war with yours. You must give me and my companions aid and assist us to return to our own land. It is the law of Barsoom." "Manator knows only the laws of Manator," replied U Dor. "But come, you shall go with us to the city, where you, being beautiful, need have no fear. I myself will protect you if O Tar so decrees. But as for your companion but hold, you said companions? There are others of your party then?" "You see what you see," replied Tara haughtily. "Be that as it may," said U Dor, "if there be more they shall not escape Manator, for as I was saying, if your companion fights well he too may live, for O Tar is just, and just are the laws of Manator. Come." Ghek demurred. "It is useless," said the girl, seeing that he would have stood his ground and fought them. "Let us go with them. Why pit your puny blade against their mighty ones when there should lie in your great brain the means to outwit them?" She spoke in a low whisper, rapidly. "You are right, Tara of Helium," he replied, and sheathed his sword. And so they moved down the hillside toward the gates of Manator, Tara, Princess of Helium, and Ghek, the kaldane of Bantoom, and surrounding them rode the savage, painted warriors of U Dor, dwar of the 8th Utan, of O Tar, Jeddak of Manator. This is the end of the Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 10. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 11. The Choice of Tara. The dazzling sunlight of Barsoom clothed Manator in an aureole of splendor as the girl and her captors rode into the city through the Gate of Enemies. Here the wall was some 50 feet thick, and the sides of the passageway within the gate were covered with parallel shelves of masonry from bottom to top. Within these shelves, or long, horizontal niches, stood row upon row of small figures, appearing like tiny, grotesque statuettes of men, their long black hair falling below their feet and sometimes trailing to the shelf beneath. The figures were scarce a foot in height, and, but for their diminutive proportions, might have been the mummified bodies of once living men. The girl noticed that as they passed, the warriors saluted the figures with their spears after the manner of Barsoomian fighting men in extending a military courtesy, and then they rode on into the avenue beyond, which ran, wide and stately, through the city toward the east. On either side were great buildings wondrously wrought. Paintings of great beauty and antiquity covered many of the walls, their colors softened and blended by the suns of ages. Upon the pavement the life of the newly awakened city was already afoot. Women in brilliant trappings, befeathered warriors, their bodies daubed with paint, artisans, armed but less gaily caparisoned, took their various ways upon the duties of the day. A giant zitidar, magnificent in rich harness, rumbled its broad-wheeled cart along the stone pavement toward the Gate of Enemies. Life and color and beauty wrought together a picture that filled the eyes of Tara of Helium with wonder and admiration, for here was a scene out of the dead past of dying Mars. Such had been the cities of the founders of her race before Throxius, mightiest of oceans, had disappeared from the face of the world, and from balconies on either side men and women looked down in silence upon the scene below. The people in the street looked at the two prisoners, especially at the hideous Ghek, and called out in question or comment to their guard. But the watchers upon the balconies spoke not, nor did one so much as turn a head to note their passing. There were many balconies on each building, and not a one that did not hold its silent party of richly trapped men and women, with here and there a child or two, but even the children maintained their uniform silence and immobility of their elders. As they approached the center of the city, the girl saw that even the roofs bore companies of these idle watchers, harnessed and bejeweled, as for some gala day of laughter and music, but no laughter broke from these silent lips, nor any music from the strings of the instruments that many of them held in jeweled fingers. And now the avenue widened into an immense square, at the far end of which rose a stately edifice gleaming white in virgin marble among the gaily painted buildings surrounding it, and its scarlet sward and gaily flowering green foliaged shrubbery. Toward this U Dor led his prisoners and their guard to the great arched entrance before which a line of 50 mounted warriors barred the way. When the commander of the guard recognized U Dor, the guardsmen fell back to either side, leaving a broad avenue through which the party passed. Directly inside the entrance were inclined runways leading upward on either side. U Dor turned to the left and led them upward to the second floor and down a long corridor. Here they passed other mounted men, and in chambers upon either side they saw more. Occasionally there was another runway leading either up or down. A warrior, his steed at full gallop, dashed into sight from one of those and raced swiftly past them upon some errand. Nowhere as yet had Tara of Helium seen a man afoot in this great building, but when at a turn U Dor led them to the third floor she caught glimpses of chambers in which many riderless thoats were penned, and others adjoining where dismounted warriors lolled at ease or played games of skill or chance, and many there were who played at jetan. And then the party passed into a long, wide hall of state, as magnificent an apartment as even a princess of mighty Helium ever had seen. The length of the room ran an arched ceiling ablaze with countless radium bulbs. The mighty spans extended from wall to wall, leaving the vast floor unbroken by a single column. The arches were of white marble, apparently quarried in single, huge blocks, from which each arch was cut complete. Between the arches, the ceiling was set solid about the radium bulbs with precious stones, whose scintillant fire and color and beauty filled the whole apartment. The stones were carried down the walls, in an irregular fringe for a few feet, where they appeared to hang like a beautiful and gorgeous drapery against the white marble of the wall. The marble ended some 6 or 7 feet from the floor, the walls from that point down being wainscoted in solid gold. The floor itself was of marble richly inlaid with gold. In that single room was a vast treasure equal to the wealth of many a large city. But what riveted the girl's attention even more than the fabulous treasure of decorations were the files of gorgeously harnessed warriors who sat their thoats in grim silence and immobility of either side of the central aisle, rank after rank of them to the farther walls, and as the party passed between them she could not note so much as the flicker of an eyelid or the twitching of a thoat's ear. "The Hall of Chiefs," whispered one of her guard, evidently noting her interest. There was a note of pride in the fellow's voice, and something of hushed awe. Then they passed through a great doorway into the chamber beyond, a large, square room in which a dozen mounted warriors lolled in their saddles. As U Dor and his party entered the room, the warriors came quickly erect in their saddles and formed a line before another door upon the opposite side of the wall. The padwar commanding them saluted U Dor, who, with his party, had halted facing the guard. "Send one to O Tar announcing that U Dor brings 2 prisoners worthy of the observation of the great jeddak," said U Dor. "One because of her extreme beauty, the other because of his extreme ugliness." "O Tar sits in council with the lesser chiefs," replied the lieutenant, "but the words of U Dor the dwar shall be carried to him," and he turned and gave instructions to one who sat his thoat behind him. "What manner of creature is the male?" he asked of U Dor. "It cannot be that both are of one race." "They were together in the hills south of the city," explained U Dor, "and they say they are lost and starving." "The woman is beautiful," said the padwar. "She will not long go begging in the city of Manator." And then they spoke of other matters, of the doings of the palace, of the expedition of U Dor, until the messenger returned to say that O Tar bade them bring the prisoners to him. They passed then through a massive doorway which, when opened, revealed the great council chamber of O Tar, jeddak of Manator, beyond. A central aisle led from the doorway the full length of the great hall, terminating at the steps of a marble dais upon which a man sat in a great throne chair. Upon either side of the aisle were ranged rows of highly carved desks and chairs of skeel, a hardwood of great beauty. Only a few of the desks were occupied, those in the front row, just below the rostrum. At the entrance U Dor dismounted with 4 of his followers, who formed a guard about the 2 prisoners, who were then conducted toward the foot of the throne, following a few paces behind U Dor. As they halted at the foot of the marble steps, the proud gaze of Tara of Helium rested upon the enthroned figure of the man above her. He sat erect, without stiffness, a commanding presence trapped in the barbaric splendor that the Barsoomian chieftain loves. He was a large man, the perfection of whose handsome face was marred only by the hauteur of his cold eyes and the suggestion of cruelty imparted by 2 thin lips. It needed no second glance to assure the least observing that here indeed was a ruler of men, a fighting jeddak whose people might worship but not love, and for whose slightest favor warriors would vie with one another to go forth and die. This was O Tar, jeddak of Manator, and as Tara of Helium saw him for the first time she could not but acknowledge a certain admiration for this savage chieftain who so virilely personified the ancient virtues of the god of war. U Dor and the jeddak interchanged the simple greetings of Barsoom, and then the former recounted the details of the discovery and the capture of the prisoners. O Tar scrutinized them both intently during U Dor's narration of events, his expression revealing naught of what passed in the brain behind those inscrutable eyes. When the officer had finished, the jeddak fastened his gaze upon Ghek. "And you," he asked, "what manner of thing are you? From what country? Why are you in Manator?" "I am a kaldane," replied Ghek. the highest type of created creature upon the face of Barsoom. I am mind. You are matter. I come from Bantoom. I am here because we were lost and starving." "And you," O Tar turned suddenly on Tara, "you too are a kaldane?" "I am a princess of Helium," replied the girl. "I was a prisoner in Bantoom. This kaldane and a warrior of my own race rescued me. The warrior left us to search for food and water. He has doubtless fallen into the hands of your people. I ask you to free him and give us food and drink and let us go upon our way. I am a granddaughter of a jeddak, the daughter of a jeddak of jeddaks, the warlord of Barsoom. I ask only the treatment that my people would accord you or yours." "Helium," repeated O Tar. "I know naught of Helium, nor does the jeddak of Helium rule Manator. I, O Tar, am jeddak of Manator. I alone rule. I protect my own. You have never seen a man or a warrior of Manator captive in Helium. Why should I protect the people of another jeddak? It is his duty to protect them. If he cannot, he is weak, and his people must fall into the hands of the strong. I, O Tar, am strong. I will keep you. That," he pointed at Ghek, "can it fight?" "It is brave," replied Tara of Helium, "but it has not the skill at arms which my people possess." "There is none then to fight for you?" asked O Tar. "We are a just people," he continued, without waiting for a reply, "and had you one to fight for you he might win to freedom for himself and you as well." "But U Dor assured me that no stranger ever had departed from Manator," she answered. O Tar shrugged. "That does not disprove the justice of the laws of Manator," replied O Tar, "but rather that the warriors of Manator are invincible. Had there come one who could defeat our warriors that one had won to liberty." "And you fetch my warrior," cried Tara haughtily. "You shall see such swordplay as doubtless the crumbling walls of your decaying city never have witnessed, and if there be no trick in your offer we are already as good as free." O Tar smiled more broadly than before, and U Dor smiled too, and the chiefs and warriors who looked on nudged one another and whispered, laughing. And Tara of Helium knew then that there was some trickery in their justice, but though her situation seemed hopeless she did not cease to hope, for was she not the daughter of John Carter, warlord of Barsoom, whose famous challenge to fate, "I still live," remained the one irreducible defense against despair? At thought of her noble sire the patrician chin of Tara of Helium rose a shade higher. Ah, if he but knew where she was there was little to fear them. The ghosts of Helium would batter at the gates of Manator. The great green warriors of John Carter's savage allies would swarm up from the dead sea bottoms, lusting for pillage and for loot. The stately ships of her beloved navy would soar above the unprotected towers and minarets of the doomed city, which only capitulation and heavy tribute could then save. But John Carter did not know. There was only one other to whom she might hope to look, Turan the Panthan. But where was he? She had seen his sword in play, and she knew that it had been wielded by a master hand, and who should know swordplay better than Tara of Helium, who had learned it well under the constant tutorage of John Carter himself. Tricks she knew that discounted even far greater physical prowess than her own, and a method of attack that might have been at once the envy and despair of the cleverest of warriors. And so it was that her thoughts turned to Turan the Panthan, though not alone because of the protection he might afford her. She had realized, since he had left her in search of food, that there had grown between them a certain comradeship that she now missed. There had been that about him which seemed to have bridged the gulf between their stations in life. With him she had failed to consider that he was a panthan or that she was a princess. They had been comrades. Suddenly she realized that she missed him for himself more than for his sword. She turned toward O Tar. "Where is Turan, my warrior?" she demanded. "You shall not lack for warriors," replied the jeddak. "One of your beauty shall find plenty to fight for her. Possibly it shall not be necessary to look further than the jeddak of Manator. You please me, woman. What say you to such an honor?" Through narrowed lids the Princess of Helium scrutinized the jeddak of Manator, from feathered headdress to sandaled foot and back to feathered headdress. "Honor!" she mimicked in tones of scorn. "I please thee, do I? Then know, swine, that thou pleasest me not, that the daughter of John Carter is not for such as thou." A sudden tense silence fell upon the assembled chiefs. Slowly the blood receded from the sinister face of O Tar, jeddak of Manator, leaving him a sickly purple in his wrath. His eyes narrowed to two thin slits. His lips were compressed to a bloodless line of malevolence. For a long moment there was no sound in the throne room of the palace at Manator. Then the jeddak turned toward U Dor. "Take her away," he said in a level voice that belied his appearance of rage. "Take her away, and at the next games let the prisoners and the common warriors play at jetan for her." "And this?" asked U Dor, pointing at Ghek. "To the pits until the next games," replied O Tar. "So this is your vaunted justice," cried Tara of Helium, "that two strangers who have not wronged you shall be sentenced without trial, and one of them is a woman? The swine of Manator are as just as they are brave." "Away with her!" shouted O Tar, and at a sign from U Dor the guards formed about the two prisoners and conducted them from the chamber. Outside the palace Ghek and Tara of Helium were separated. The girl was led through long avenues toward the center of the city, and finally into a low building topped by lofty towers of massive construction. Here she was turned over to a warrior who wore the insignia of a dwar, or captain. "It is O Tar's wish," explained U Dor to this one, "that she be kept until the next games, when the prisoners and the common warriors shall play for her. Had she not the tongue of a thoat she had been a worthy stake for our noblest steel," and U Dor sighed. "Perhaps even yet I may win a pardon for her. It were too bad to see such beauty fall to the lot of some common fellow. I would have honored her myself." "If I am to be imprisoned, imprison me," said the girl. "I do not recall that I was sentenced to listen to the insults of every low born boor who chanced to admire me." "You see, A Kor," cried U Dor, "the tongue that she has. Even so, and worse, spoke she to O Tar the jeddak." "I see," replied A Kor, whom Tara saw was with difficulty restraining a smile. "Come then with me, woman," he said, "and we shall find a safe place within the towers of jetan. But stay, what ails thee?" The girl had staggered and would have fallen had not the man caught her in his arms. She seemed to gather herself then and bravely sought to stand erect without support. A Kor glanced at U Dor. "Knew ye the woman was ill?" he asked. "Possibly it is lack of food," replied the other. "She mentioned, I believe, that she and her companions had not eaten for several days." "Brave are the warriors of O Tar," sneered A Kor. "Lavish their hospitality, U Dor, whose riches are uncounted, and the brave O Tar, whose squealing thoats are stabled within marble halls and fed from troughs of gold, can spare no crust to feed a starving girl." The black-haired U Dor scowled. "Thy tongue will yet pierce thy heart, son of a slave," he cried. "Once too often mayst thus try the patience of the just O Tar. Hereafter guard thy speech as well as thy towers." "Think not to taunt me with my mother's state," said A Kor. "'Tis the blood of the slave woman that fills my veins with pride, and my only shame is that I am also the son of thy jeddak." "And O Tar heard this?" queried U Dor. "O Tar has already heard it from mine own lips," replied A Kor. "This and more." He turned upon his heels, a supporting arm still around the waist of Tara of Helium, and thus he half led, half carried her into the towers of jetan, while U Dor wheeled his thoat and galloped back in the direction of the palace. Within the main entrance to the Tower of Jetan lolled a half-dozen warriors. To one of these spoke Acor, keeper of the towers. "Fetch Lano, the slave girl, and bid her bring food and drink to the upper level of the Thurian tower." Then he lifted the half-fainting girl in his arms and bore her along the spiral inclined runway that led upward within the tower. Somewhere in the long ascent Tara lost consciousness. When it returned she found herself in a large circular chamber, the stone walls of which were pierced by windows at regular intervals about the entire circumference of the room. She was lying upon a pile of sleeping silks and furs, while there knelt above her a young woman who was forcing drops of some cooling beverage between her parched lips. Tara of Helium half rose upon an elbow and looked about. In the first moments of returning consciousness there were swept from the screen of recollection the happenings of many weeks. She thought that she awoke in the palace of the warlord at Helium. Her brows knit as she scrutinized the strange face bending over her. "Who are you?" she asked, "and where is Uthia?" "I am Lano, the slave girl," replied the other. "I know none by the name of Uthia." Tara of Helium sat erect and looked about her. This rough stone was not the marble of her father's halls. "Where am I?" she asked. "In the Thurian tower," replied the girl, and then seeing that the other still did not understand she guessed the truth. "You are a prisoner in the towers of Jetan in the city of Manator," she explained. "You were brought to this chamber, weak and fainting, by Acor, dwar of the towers of Jetan, who sent me to you with food and drink, for kind is the heart of Ator." "I remember now," said Tara slowly. "I remember. But where is Turan, my warrior? Did they speak of him?" "I heard naught of another," replied Lano. "You alone were brought to the towers. In that you are fortunate, for there be no nobler man in Manator than Acor. It is his mother's blood that makes him so. She was a slave girl from Gathol." "Gathol!" exclaimed Tara of Helium. "Lies Gathol close by Manator?" "Not close, yet still the nearest country," replied Lano. "About 22 degrees east it lies." "Gathol," murmured Tara. "Far Gathol." "But you are not from Gathol," said the slave girl. "Your harness is not of Gathol." "I am from Helium," said Tara. "It is far from Helium to Gathol," said the slave girl, "but in our studies we learned much of the greatness of Helium, we of Gathol, so it seems not so far away." "You too are from Gathol?" asked Tara. "Many of us are from Gathol who are slaves in Manator," replied the girl. "It is to Gathol, nearest country, that the Mantorians look for slaves most often. They go in great numbers at intervals of 3 or 7 years and haunt the roads that lead to Gathol, and thus they capture whole caravans, leaving none to bear warning to Gathol of their fate. Nor do any ever escape from Manator to carry word of us back to Gahan or Jed." Tara of Helium ate slowly and in silence. The girl's words aroused memories of the last hours she had spent in her father's palace, and the great midday function at which she had met Gahan of Gathol. Even now she flushed as she recalled his daring words. Upon her reveries the door opened and a burly warrior appeared in the opening, a hulking fellow with thick lips and an evil, leering face. The slave girl sprang to her feet, facing him. "What does this mean, Emed?" she cried. "Was it not the will of Acor that this woman be not disturbed?" "The will of Acor, indeed!" and the man sneered. "The will of Acor is without power in the towers of Jetan or elsewhere, for Acor lies now in the pits of O-Tar, and Emed is dwar of the towers." Tara of Helium saw the face of the slave girl pale, and the terror in her eyes. This is the end of the Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 11. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Chessmen of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 12. Ghek Plays Pranks. While Tara of Helium was being led to the towers of Jetan, Ghek was escorted to the pits beneath the palace, where he was imprisoned in a dimly lighted chamber. Here he found a bench and a table standing upon the dirt floor near the wall, and set in the wall several rings from which depended short lengths of chain. At the base of the walls were several holes in the dirt floor. These alone of the several things he saw interested him. Ghek sat down upon the bench and waited in silence, listening. Presently the lights were extinguished. If Ghek could have smiled, he would have then, for Ghek could see as well in the dark as in the light. Better, perhaps. He watched the dark openings of the holes in the floor and waited. Presently he detected a change in the air about him. It grew heavy with a strange odor, and once again might Ghek have smiled, could he have smiled. Let them replace all the air in the chamber with their most deadly fumes. It would be all the same to Ghek, the kaldane, who, having no lungs, required no air. With the rykor it might be different. Deprived of air, it would die, but if only a sufficient amount of the gas were introduced to stupefy an ordinary creature, it would have no effect upon the rykor, who had no objective mind to overcome. So long as the excess of carbon dioxide in the blood was not sufficient to prevent heart action, the rykor would suffer only a diminution of vitality, but would still respond to the exciting agency of the kaldane's brain. Ghek caused the rykor to assume a sitting position, with its back against the wall, where it might remain without direction from his brain. Then he released his contact with its spinal cord, but remained in position upon its shoulders, waiting and watching, for the kaldane's curiosity was aroused. He had not long to wait before the lights were flashed on and one of the locked doors opened to admit a half-dozen warriors. They approached him rapidly and worked quickly. First they removed all his weapons, and then, snapping a fetter about one of the rykor's ankles, secured him to the end of one of the chains hanging from the walls. Next they dragged the long table to a new position and there bolted it to the floor so that an end, instead of the middle, was directly before the prisoner. On the table before him they set food and water, and upon the opposite end of the table they laid the key to the fetter. Then they unlocked and opened all the doors and departed. When Turan the panthan regained consciousness, it was to the realization of a sharp pain in one of his forearms. The effects of the gas departed as rapidly as they had overcome him, so that as he opened his eyes he was in full possession of all his faculties. The lights were on again, and in their glow there was revealed to the man the figure of a giant Martian rat crouching upon the table and gnawing upon his arm. Snatching his arm away he reached for his short sword, while the rat, growling, sought to seize his arm again. It was then that Turan discovered that his weapons had been removed: short sword, long sword, dagger, and pistol. The rat charged him then, and striking the creature away with his hand, the man rose and backed off, searching for something with which to strike a harder blow. Again the rat charged, and as Turan stepped quickly back to avoid the menacing jaws, something seemed to jerk suddenly upon his right ankle, and as he drew his left foot back to regain his equilibrium, his heel caught upon a taut chain, and he fell heavily backward to the floor, just as the rat leaped upon his breast and sought his throat. The Martian rat is a fierce and unlovely thing. It is many-legged and hairless, its hide resembling that of a newborn mouse in repulsiveness. In size and weight it is comparable to a large Airedale terrier. Its eyes are small and close set and almost hidden in deep fleshy apertures, but its most ferocious and repulsive feature is its jaws, the entire bony structure of which protrudes several inches beyond the flesh, revealing 5 sharp, spade-like teeth in the upper jaw and the same number of similar teeth in the lower, the whole suggesting the appearance of a rotting face from which much of the flesh has sloughed away. It was such a thing that it leaped upon the breast of the panthan to tear at his jugular. Twice Turan struck it away as he sought to regain his feet, but both times it returned with increased ferocity to renew its attack. Its only weapons are its jaws, since its broad, splay feet are armed with blunt talons. With its protruding jaws it excavates its winding burrows, and with its broad feet it pushes the dirt behind it. To keep the jaws from his flesh, then, was Turan's only concern, and this he succeeded in doing until chance gave him a hold upon the creature's throat. After that the end was but a matter of moments. Rising at last, he flung the lifeless thing from him with a shudder of disgust. Now he turned his attention to a hurried inventory of the new conditions which surrounded him since the moment of his incarceration. He realized vaguely what had happened. He had been anesthetized and stripped of his weapons, and as he rose to his feet he saw that one ankle was fettered to a chain in the wall. He looked about the room. All the doors swung wide open. His captors would render his imprisonment the more cruel by leaving ever before him tempting glimpses of open aisles to the freedom he could not attain. Upon the end of the table, and within easy reach, was food and drink. This at least was attainable, and at sight of it his starved stomach seemed almost to cry aloud for sustenance. It was with difficulty that he ate and drank in moderation. As he devoured the food, his eyes wandered about the confines of his prison, until suddenly they seized upon a thing that lay on the table at the end farthest from him. It was a key. He raised his fettered ankle and examined the lock. There could be no doubt of it. The key that lay there on the table before him was the key to that very lock. A careless warrior had laid it there and departed, forgetting. Hope surged high in the breast of Gahan of Gathol, of Turan the panthan. Furtively his eyes sought the open doorways. There was no one in sight. Ah, if he could but gain his freedom, he would find some way from this odious city back to her side, and never again would he leave her until he had won safety for her or death for himself. He rose and moved cautiously toward the opposite end of the table where lay the coveted key. The fettered ankle halted his first step, but he stretched at full length along the table, extending eager fingers toward the prize. They almost laid hold upon it. A little more and they would touch it. He strained and stretched, but still the thing lay just beyond his reach. He hurled himself forward until the iron fetter bit deep into his flesh, but all futilely. He sat back upon the bench then, and glared at the open doors and the key, realizing now that they were part of a well-laid scheme of refined torture, none the less demoralizing because it inflicted no physical suffering. For just a moment the man gave way to useless regret and foreboding. Then he gathered himself together, his brows cleared, and he returned to his unfinished meal. At least they should not have the satisfaction of knowing how sorely they had hit him. As he ate, it occurred to him that by dragging the table along the floor he could bring the key within his reach, but when he essayed to do so he found that the table had been securely bolted to the floor during the period of his unconsciousness. Again Gahan smiled and shrugged and resumed his eating. When the warriors had departed from the prison in which Ghek was confined, the kaldane crawled from the shoulders of the rykor to the table. Here he drank a little water and then directed the hands of the rykor to the balance of it and to the food, upon which the brainless thing fell with avidity. While it was thus engaged, Ghek took his spider-like way along the table to the opposite end where lay the key to the fetter. Seizing it in his chela, he leaped to the floor and scurried rapidly toward the mouth of one of the burrows against the wall, into which he disappeared. For long had the brain been contemplating these burrow entrances. They appealed to his kaldanean tastes, and further, they pointed a hiding place for the key and a lair for the only kind of food that the kaldane relished, flesh and blood. Ghek had never seen an ulsio, since these great Martian rats had long ago disappeared from Bantoom, their flesh and blood having been greatly relished by the kaldanes, but Ghek had inherited, almost unimpaired, every memory of every ancestor, and so he knew that ulsio inhabited these lairs and that ulsio were good to eat, and he knew what ulsio looked like and what his habits were, though he had never seen him nor any picture of him. As we breed animals for the transmission of physical attributes, so the kaldanes breed themselves for the transmission of attributes of the mind, including memory and the power of recollection, and thus have they raised what we term instinct above the level of the threshold of the objective mind, where it may be commanded and utilized by recollection. Doubtless, in our own subjective minds lie many of the impressions and experiences of our forebears. These may impinge upon our consciousness in dreams only, or in vague, haunting suggestions that we have before experienced some transient phase of our present existence. Ah, if we had but the power to recall them! Before us would unfold the forgotten story of the lost eons that have preceded us. We might even walk with God in the garden of his stars, while man was still but a budding idea within his mind. Ghek descended into the burrow at a steep incline for some 10 feet. When he found himself in an elaborate and delightful network of burrows, the kaldane was elated. This, indeed, was life. He moved rapidly and fearlessly, and he went as straight to his goal as you could to the kitchen of your own home. This goal lay at a low level in a spheroidal cavity about the size of a large barrel. Here, in a nest of torn bits of silk and fur, lay 6 baby ulsios. When the mother returned, there were but 5 babies and a great spider-like creature, which she immediately sprang to attack, only to be met by powerful chelae which seized and held her so that she could not move. Slowly they dragged her throat toward a hideous mouth, and in a little moment she was dead. Ghek might have remained in the nest for a long time, since there was ample food for many days, but he did not do so. Instead, he explored the burrows. He followed them into many subterranean chambers of the city of Manator, and upward through walls to rooms above the ground. He found many ingeniously devised traps, and he found poisoned food and other signs of the constant battle that the inhabitants of Manator waged against these repulsive creatures that dwelt beneath their homes and public buildings. His exploration revealed not only the vast proportions of the network of runways that apparently traversed every portion of the city, but the great antiquity of the majority of them. Tons upon tons of dirt must have been removed, and for a long time he wondered where it had been deposited, until, in following downward a tunnel of great size and length, he sensed before him the thunderous rush of subterranean waters, and presently came to the bank of a great underground river, tumbling onward, no doubt, the length of a world to the buried sea of Omin. Into this torrential sewer had unthinkable generations of ulsios pushed their few handfuls of dirt in the excavating of their vast labyrinth. For only a moment did Ghek tarry by the river, for his seemingly aimless wanderings were in reality prompted by a definite purpose, and this he pursued with vigor and singleness of design. He followed such runways as appeared to terminate in the pits or other chambers of the inhabitants of the city, and these he explored, usually from the safety of a burrow's mouth, until satisfied that what he sought was not there. He moved swiftly upon his spider legs and covered remarkable distances in short periods of time. His search not being rewarded with immediate success, he decided to return to the pit where his rykor lay chained and look to its wants. As he approached the end of the burrow that terminated in the pit, he slackened his pace, stopping just within the entrance of the runway that he might scan the interior of the chamber before entering it. As he did so, he saw the figure of a warrior appear suddenly in an opposite doorway. The rykor sprawled upon the table, his hands groping blindly for more food. Ghek saw the warrior pause and gaze in sudden astonishment at the rykor. He saw the fellow's eyes go wide and an ashen hue replace the copper bronze of his cheek. He stepped back as though someone had struck him in the face. For an instant only he stood thus, as in a paralysis of fear. Then he uttered a smothered shriek and turned and fled. Again was it a catastrophe that Ghek, the kaldane, could not smile? Quickly entering the room, he crawled to the tabletop and affixed himself to the shoulders of his rykor, and there he waited. And who may say that Ghek, though he could not smile, possessed not a sense of humor? For a half hour he sat there, and then there came to him the sound of men approaching along corridors of stone. He could hear their arms clank against the rocky walls, and he knew that they came at a rapid pace, but just before they reached the entrance to his prison they paused and advanced more slowly. In the lead was an officer, and just behind him, wide-eyed and perhaps still a little ashen, the warrior who had so recently departed in haste. At the doorway they halted, and the officer turned sternly upon the warrior. With upraised finger he pointed at Ghek. "There sits the creature. Didst thou dare lie then to thy dwar?" "I swear," cried the warrior, "that I spoke the truth. But a moment since the thing grovelled, headless, upon this very table, and may my first ancestor strike me dead upon the spot if I speak other than a true word." The officer looked puzzled. The men of Mars seldom, if ever, lie. He scratched his head. Then he addressed Ghek. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Who knows better than those who placed me here and chained me to a wall?" he returned in reply. "Saw you this warrior enter here a few minutes since?" "I saw him," replied Ghek. "And you sat there where you sit now?" continued the officer. "Look thou to my chain, and tell me then where else I might sit," cried Ghek. "Art the people of thy city all fools?" Three other warriors pressed behind the two in front, craning their necks to view the prisoner while they grinned at the discomfiture of their fellow. The officer scowled at Ghek. "Thy tongue is as venomous as that of the she-banth O Tar sent to the towers of Jetan," he said. "You speak of the young woman who was captured with me?" asked Ghek, his expressionless monotone and face revealing naught of the interest he felt. "I speak of her," replied the dwar, and then turning to the warrior who had summoned him, "Return to thy quarters and remain there until the next games. Perhaps by that time thy eyes may have learned not to deceive thee." The fellow cast a venomous glance at Ghek and turned away. The officer shook his head. "I do not understand it," he muttered. "Always has Uvan been a true and dependable warrior. Could it be?" He glanced piercingly at Ghek. "Thou hast a strange head that misfits thy body, fellow," he cried. "Our legends tell us of those ancient creatures that placed hallucinations upon the mind of their fellows. If thou be such, then maybe Uvan suffered from thy forbidden powers. If thou be such, O Tar will know well how to deal with thee." He wheeled about and motioned his warriors to follow him. "Wait," cried Ghek. "Unless I am to be starved, send me food." "You have had food," replied the warrior. "Am I to be fed but once a day?" asked Ghek. "I require food oftener than that. Send me food." "You shall have food," replied the officer. "None may say that the prisoners of Manator are ill fed. Just are the laws of Manator," and he departed. No sooner had the sounds of their passing died away in the distance than Ghek clambered from the shoulders of his rykor and scurried to the burrow where he had hidden the key. Fetching it, he unlocked the fetter from about the creature's ankle, locked it empty, and carried the key farther down into the burrow. Then he returned to his place upon the brainless servitor. After a while he heard footsteps approaching. whereupon he rose and passed into another corridor from that down which he knew the warrior was coming. Here he waited out of sight, listening. He heard the man enter the chamber and halt. He heard a muttered exclamation, followed by the jangle of metal dishes as a salver was slammed upon the table. Then rapidly retreating footsteps, which quickly died away in the distance. Ghek lost no time in returning to the chamber, recovering the key, relocking the rykor to his chain. Then he replaced the key in the burrow and, squatting on the table beside his headless body, directed its hands toward the food. While the rykor ate, Ghek sat listening for the scraping sandals and clattering arms that he knew soon would come. Nor had he long to wait. Ghek scrambled to the shoulders of his rykor as he heard them coming. Again it was the officer who had been summoned by Uban, and with him were 3 warriors. The one directly behind him was evidently the same who had brought the food, for his eyes went wide when he saw Ghek sitting at the table, and he looked very foolish as the dwar turned his stern glance upon him. "It is even as I said," he cried. "He was not here when I brought his food." "But he is here now," said the officer grimly, "and his fetter is locked about his ankle. Look! It has not been opened, but where is the key? It should be upon the table at the end opposite him. Where is the key, creature?" he shouted at Ghek. "How should I, a prisoner, know better than my jailer the whereabouts of the key to my fetters?" he retorted. "But it lay here," cried the officer, pointing to the other end of the table. "Did you see it?" asked Ghek. The officer hesitated. "No, but it must have been there," he parried. "Did you see the key lying there?" asked Ghek, pointing to another warrior. The fellow shook his head negatively. And you," continued the kaldane, addressing the others. They both admitted that they never had seen the key. "And if it had been there, how could I have reached it?" he continued. "No, he could not have reached it," admitted the officer. "But there shall be no more of this. I Zav, you will remain here on guard with this prisoner until you are relieved." I Zav looked anything but happy as this intelligence was transmitted to him, and he eyed Ghek suspiciously as the dwar and the other warriors turned and left him to his unhappy lot. This is the end of the Chessmen of Mars, Chapter 12. Recording by Tom Weiss.